power on.
The following is a presentation of the Sovryn podcast feed.
Ooh, the man of tomorrow here for you, baby. And it is hot, hotter than hell. And I don't just mean the temperature on Ice Planet Zero. I also mean this panel that is getting a special release in the Sovryn feed for a special treat with this. Because you are going to hear, this is, again, a part two, part two, a little Hot Shots reference there. This is a part two of the spirituality panel. The first one, which was also released in the Sovryn podcast feed, you can go back and listen to. I was honored to be a part of this one as well. There will be some familiar names, besides Sec and Penguin, of course, because we did this through the Agora podcast. There will be some familiar names on this one, but then also a new name in Katron, who practices Bruharia. And this is a rare, I don't even want to use, I'm going to say sacred practice, okay? I don't even want to use religion. Spirituality, of course, I'm not the biggest fan of that term. But this is a very rare sacred practice, or if you want to go there, spiritual practice. You just never really get to hear much about anywhere, okay? That comes out of, that has, its long tradition in Mexico. You're in for a treat because you're hearing something, again, so special. You think, when I talk about Kabbalah and other things, that all of that is super rare. Oh man, Bruharia is on a whole other level. So it's really cool to be able to do a podcast with someone who practices that, as well as just the overall conversations that are had are phenomenal. I can imagine there's going to be more of these spirituality panels in the future. If I get asked to be on again, of course I will. If there's room to be made for other practices, other spirituality, whatever other religions, then by all means be on there. But it's exciting stuff to see how these all kind of in some ways come together. I'm such a major proponent of the concept of many paths, one mountain. Right? The mountain being the quote-unquote truth. And these panels, especially these spirituality panels, are a big part of that, I think, of exploring those paths. Again, I'm not a fan of the word spirituality. I don't mind the word mysticism. There's terms that I don't mind so much. But a lot of that gets explored, of course, in part one. Part deux here, I'm sure that conversation comes up a bit as well. And again, just a fantastic collection of individuals and in some ways practices that you rarely hear anywhere else. And so it's so cool that the Agora podcast is putting this together. Always an honor for me to be on as well. And it is here for you to enjoy. So I'm going to let this ride out. I want to say we recorded this. It was either late May or early June of 2024. But now it is finally being released to the public, to you, to enjoy. So rock and roll, and of course check out more that's been coming out on the Agora podcast, and plenty of things to come out in the Sovryn podcast feed in very short order. But with all that, I will see all of you, on the other side. Let's go to the spirituality panel, part 2.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Agora Podcast. We're back. It's your home for agorism, localism, radical decentralization, and anti-authoritarian concepts. It's me, Penguin, here with Agora, of course, as usual, as always. But we also have a panel discussion. It's actually part 2 that we had ended up deciding to do. As an addendum or a sequel or whatever to our spirituality and religion panel last time. That went so well. It's kind of a fun topic. And, like most things, we got pretty much only superficially far with it. It's definitely, we said there was a lot more to be said. And, well, you should, if you probably listen to the first first one of those panels if you want to kind of get some bearings of what we're talking about, especially since we're probably not going to completely repeat ourselves, but we don't have the exact same panel. So, Sec, how you doing? And you want to just introduce, I don't know if everybody wants to introduce themselves or however we want to do that.
I'm doing okay, tired and old. But yeah, real quick. We got Brian, Dr. Brian Sovryn of Sovryn.
You should know who he is.
Yeah, everyone knows who he is. Awe of I Hate the Antichrist podcast. And Shane from last time was unable to make it the last minute. He had a family thing to do. So we're not, like Penguin said, go listen to the first episode of this before you listen to this one, because we laid down a bunch of groundwork last time. And I was joking with Brian before last time we recorded this. It's like, yeah, we're going to take the biggest topics in the universe and try to get them in like an hour and a half. And that just never really happened. So this is bleeding over into a second episode, and we'll see how far we get with that. But yeah, the general topic is, spirituality and religion as a liberatory tool. So the only one
by another guest.
Yes. Who was not here last time. Katron is with us. Katron, can you introduce yourself to the audience and maybe tell us a little bit about your own spiritual practice? Hello?
Okay, sorry, just had to figure out my mute button here.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep, can hear you good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so hi, yeah, my name is Katron. I'm just, for the most part, a general shit poster on Twitter, but I also do practice brujeria, and along with traditional Mexican brujeria, I would say. Along with, I'm a huge follower of Santa Muerte, so I do post a lot about that. My family has been practicing for many generations, so it's just kind of like a thing that I grew up with, that it was just there, and apparently it's interesting for people because it's not a lot of I would say accurate knowledge out there, regarding this topic. So I'm very honored that you guys have me on here. Because again, I'm just your run-of-the-mill shit poster on Twitter.
No, that's great. And thank you for joining us. And since you weren't here, I was going to ask you a quick question. What is it that you described that you were a follower of? Can you say it slowly and kind of define it and give us some general overview of that?
Yeah, so my family has been practicing brujeria, which is just generally witchcraft in very non-traditional sense, because usually when you're used to witchcraft, you're used to the standardized American Wicca kind of stuff. I would just kind of that, I would say. But with us, it has more of a, basically we took traditions that we had, pre-Hispanic traditions that we had, and had to hide them within Catholicism. So a lot of the stuff is very much related with Catholicism as well. So we'll have practices that include, some traditional Catholic prayers, and that's along with, with following Santa Muerte as well. So it's quite a bit of a mixture there, that is included within that whole line of practice per se. Just kind of, yeah.
Okay, and forgive me. Can you spell the word for me? Because I'm still I actually have never heard of this before.
It's named after the sick metal band who I saw in concert a bunch of times, but it's BRUJERIA, right?
I knew there's going to be a J, a Spanish J in there.
Yeah, just
sorry, go ahead.
In Spanish, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So basically, that's. Just kind of in a nutshell. I think if maybe somebody sorry guys, I'm just really not good with podcasts sometimes. Just ask me questions.
You're doing just fine. You're doing just fine.
But yeah.
What does your day-to-day
so
look
that's
like?
just in a nutshell. Well, generally speaking, and again, I just it's just depending on, just something that's a little bit more popular, for example, would be the egg cleanse. Just something to kind of just simplify it and just kind of give you an idea. So basically, it is believed that, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the concept of like evil eye, things like that. With us, we also have that belief. So you'll have, when somebody's not feeling well, someone's sick, fuzzy baby, we have a tradition where we, and this is not even just like within witchcraft. This is just, within the Mexican tradition as well. I'm not quite sure if other Latin American countries have this, but this is just for us, I guess. So we have practices where if, like, let's say you're not feeling well, you'll grab an egg, kind of just pass it down the person's body while saying, Hail Mary at the same time, and then just crack the egg in a glass of water, and then just contingent on what the egg looks like, you'll see, like this is what's, they're not feeling well. Somebody is putting, witchcraft on them, or they're just, somebody's envying them, just kind of things like that. Just very, I guess, kind of like that. Just something that we do traditionally. Again, these were ancient practices that we had to hide, from the Catholic Church, and it just integrated and it mixed in within those practices.
It's always very interesting to me how similar a lot of these ancient practices were, especially when in regards to ritual magic, because that sounds like a lot of other schools of mysticism or witchcraft that I've heard before. Very similar. So, well, cool. Well, welcome aboard. I'm going to open this up to the panel. This is kind of where I want to go next, unless somebody else wants to go somewhere different. But in what way do we think spirituality or mysticism or anything of that sort is more conducive to the liberation of humans than, say, I don't know, pick your buzzword for it, but modernity or our scientific materialist society or anything of that sort? Do we think that one is more conducive to liberation and one is more conducive to, say, state power or domination? And anybody?
I would say that one of the advantages that really any of the mystical traditions have, from basically every religion, every corner, it's not so much the practices so much as it is the the mentality behind the practices. So, for example, in Christian mysticism, it's all about developing your own morality through letting go. That's the main primary focus, and that really has this ability to calm and soothe the soul, to keep yourself in a position of of peace with others. It's pretty powerful, honestly, and it's very helpful for any sort of interaction you have with other people, to be able to maintain that kind of interpersonal peace between you and others, and without there being a state structure overhead. I mean, you say what you want about the state. I'm obviously no fan. I don't think anybody here is, being agorists or agorist adjacent. The state's purpose and what it does do is, as far as regular citizens are concerned, it keeps a decent amount of peace between us. I mean, that's the purpose of it, at least. Whether it accomplishes it well or not is a different story, but that's the point of it. That's the stated goal. And as far as it's concerned, without there being some sort of structure overhead, you basically just have the human interaction itself. And having a mystical tradition really gives you an idea of the soul. It gives you an idea of the inherent worth of other people around you. It gives you this sense of belonging with your community, and a slew of different things. So.
Yeah, I'd add on top of that. I think that, speaking of particularly scientific materialism, that's an outcropping very much of the Enlightenment era. And as powerful as that is, as powerful as, shall we say, the exterior sciences are, and how much they've genuinely helped humanity. I mean, I think there's upper limits to just about anything, except for perhaps spirituality. But as helpful as that's been, I think a byproduct of the focus on scientific materialism, or what we could call the exterior sciences, is that the interior sciences were left behind. The interior universe was no longer being studied, partly because it's rather immeasurable. It's not just immeasurable, it's ineffable. And when that got left behind, a huge part of what it means to be human, a huge part of the human condition got left behind. And perhaps most importantly, in fact, I would even argue, so without spirituality, there isn't really an individuality, because if you're just going off of scientific materialism, I think you run into this scenario where you constantly, you feel a certain lack of power, of personal power. And you become reliant on exterior, just as you only measure the exterior universe, the universe that we see and touch outside of us. You start to become reliant upon power structures outside of you, because that's all you believe in, is what's outside of you instead of what's inside of you. And so when we leave the interior sciences, if we want to call it that, or the interior universe, I don't like the word soul, but one could certainly use that if they wanted to. Okay. When you leave that behind, you leave behind a lot of your personal power. Sure, we can have personal power that affects the exterior universe. We can build up our muscles, we can have weapons, we can have whatever. But in a very real way, you can have knowledge in how to engage, say, what's outside of you with a sense of power. But without the internal confidence, kind of like Awe was saying there, without that internal confidence, it's really a faux sense of power. It's not a real sense of power. So you need to have the confidence and the knowledge of your interior universe to be able to confidently engage what's outside of you. And so when we ignore that, and that really does come down to spirituality, because science can't measure anything that's inside of you. And what I mean by that is like your consciousness. Science can't even, scientific materialism can't even answer what consciousness is. It doesn't know, but yet it's there. Okay. And that's a key part of the interior sciences. So yeah, I would say without it, there is no actual liberation. Without it, you have no confidence in yourself. And you do find yourself, I think, relying upon structures like the state, militaries, go down the list of it. As to where if you recognize your personal power, you might recognize you don't need those things anymore. So that's my thoughts on that.
Penguin, Katron, do either of you have something to add to that, or?
Katron, you go first.
Okay. So yeah, just kind of piggybacking off of what was previously said. And I'm sorry, I did not hear the first stream of it, so I'm hoping I'm not kind of like jumping into things that were talked about. But it's also important to remember that a lot of negating a lot of, just kind of like the whole concept of, the whole concept of no gods, no masters, it's just, in my opinion, within anarchism, it's such a an antiquated and very dangerous thing, to kind of just sprout about, because it's the same thing that essentially negated a lot of other ancient traditions that are basically re-emerging, and especially with a lot of anarchists, from like indigenous traditions to some other pagan traditions that are being reborn, and then it's just in a sense of self-liberation from the religions that that you were brought to practice growing up. A lot of people that were raised Catholic or Christian or whatever the case may be, and they're returning to the old traditions that they had, and it's essentially a way to of self-liberation. So I think it's time to get rid of the no gods, no masters way of thinking, to be, in my opinion, because you are negating another person's self-liberation.
This is what happens when you start becoming an anarchist or libertarian off of playing BioShock.
Seriously.
That was well. I've never played BioShock, so I'm out of the loop. I don't get the reference at all. I'm lame. I know.
But anyways,
Penguin,
that was a while ago. But I haven't gamed in like
Patreon. That was well
15
said,
years.
for sure.
Yeah. Well, as the resident mysticism Scrooge, monotheistic mysticism Scrooge, like from last time, I think I have a pretty standard and straightforward idea. I mean, I do believe in one master, and that's the Almighty God, and therefore, I will not and cannot bow my head to any other man. It's pretty much that simple. Like, you can't lay down the law. You can't have true sovereign authority, and it doesn't mean obviously you can't have authority. Like, you can have a boss. I mean, there's pros and cons with that concept. You can have a leader, someone that you choose to take orders from, take orders or advice from, or you can have a people with authority in the sense of like credentials or proven skills or track record, or usually a lifetime of experience in a given topic. But when it comes to sovereign authority, that crown, that right to unsheath your sword and take somebody's life, to lay down your law, that simply does not exist. That authority can only be sort of an authority. Any authority of that sort that would exist would be just have to be in service of like a justice itself, essentially. Like, there is no rule of man. There is only one sovereign authority, and obviously that has been interpreted in many different ways. But one way it can't be interpreted is sort of the direct form of rulership, where you actually get on one knee or get on both knees and kowtow or bow your head in front of a living human being, which just cannot happen.
So what I'm hearing, a common theme from sort of everybody here, is that essentially spirituality, whatever form that may take, is it's giving you a sense of power or sovereignty that exists outside of state power or any kind of domination, whether that be from an external source like a god, or an internal source like yourself, your consciousness, or your Nzinga, your unique, or whatever you would like to call it. That I tend to agree with that.
I just want to add something that Dr. Sovryn said, because I didn't actually address that in my whole comment. Also, like you mentioned, the internal, not speaking so much about internalism, but about the unseen. Like, that obviously is like a common factor of religion. Yeah, like belief in Islam it requires a belief in the unseen. That means obviously not in terms of like authority or power, but scientific materialism. Like, there is clearly, and people continue to look for, no matter how scientific we get, no matter how advanced science and technology get, people continue to look for things that are unseen, either that are explainable by a further advancement of science, which is as proven to be, when you see stuff like quantum, muted myself, seems to be proven to be a lot more difficult than people have thought in the past. So there clearly now is, even with the beginning of like quantum physics, and now when we're beyond quantum physics and like, this isn't really provable or reproducible or whatever, and this is all beyond me, but this is my understanding. Like, not only is there room for a god that there supposedly wasn't within like the basic Newtonian physics, there's even that framework is failing to be provable, and there's infinite room in basic scientific understanding now for any sort of unseen. And basically, there's an infinite unseen that we're having, essentially, with all the scientific research that's being done. That there is like an infinite unknown that we're now aware of exists, and even beyond like advanced, physics and theoretical physics. Just we don't see in our age any lack of people wanting sort of meaning outside of the sort of material or materialistic world. Clearly there is no lack. And when people sort of give up religions that are historically based, like a historical religion, clearly, very obviously to me, they pick up religious devotion and religious belief in other sorts of views. And I know that's pretty commonly pointed out, but clearly people want the things that religion provides, and they will create it one way or another.
Yeah, that's actually sort of where I was going, is that, this is what Nietzsche said when he said God is dead, and he wasn't making some edgelord comment or whatever and going in celebration.
Yes.
He was actually saying that without this religious structure, people are going to find their own, a new religion, whatever that may be, a new God. And I think people, and this is an old trope, right? But I think a lot of a certain type of atheists and rationalists have chosen a new God, and it's probably a more fervent devotion even to, the state or scientific materialism or whatever it is, society, pick your God, right? But and I think, this has been said over and over again, but I think it's more or less true. And, just from my own personal journey, I used to really hate religion a lot more. I'm still an atheist, and I don't really believe in gods, at least how most people would define them. I think there's probably other non-human intelligences, that maybe even those that exist outside of space-time, but I would still be an atheist. But in the past, I really had a strong hatred for Abrahamic, especially the Abrahamic religions, and I thought it was responsible for a lot of the domination and suffering that we see now and throughout history. But then the more you kind of study history, and I'll give you an example, there's a pastor, and I think he's in Florida, and he's an older dude, and he's been arrested 96 times for breaking the law for feeding the homeless. Now, that dude is my fucking hero. So for a lot of the ills that sort of religion and belief has done, I think then all of these things are true. You go throughout history, you go through history, and a lot of these radical movements, even going back to the Quakers in the 1600s, where they were abolitionists, they were for women's suffrage, and they're all most of them were pacifist, and a lot of them were hung. A lot of them were hung by George Washington for refusing to fight in the war. You could fast forward, you go to the anti-nuclear movement and the anti-war movement, and starting in the 50s, and it was a lot of Catholics and Jews. A lot of the early anarchists were, Jews and Catholics and whatever else. And you might say that they were an oppressed religious minority, especially in the United States, because it was largely waspy here. And maybe that's why you see a lot of that. But I think a lot of that sort of depends on having, like we've been talking about so far, is just having some kind of source outside of our rationalist modern post-enlightenment modern nation state, and I think that's where we're at. And I think a lot of people are noticing the failures of our materialist society. I mean that in both in the consumerist sense and in the material is all there is, and all we are is meat robots, and that's all there is to it. And I think one more thing, and I'll let you get your piece in. I think scientific materialism has the tendency to reduce things to numbers and reduce things to categories that like Penguin said, are starting to break down in the sense that we realize that there's way more to the universe that maybe can't even be measured or even spoken about in described in words. And so I think that's why you're seeing a resurgence in, like Katron said, in more indigenous forms of spiritual practice and paganism and mysticism and the New Age stuff too. And honestly, I mean, Orthodox Christianity is big right now. People are moving back to that and all kinds of weird and all kinds of other stuff. But I think that's the reason why you're the failures of materialism have never been more obvious. Oh, wait, go for it.
So I'm actually pretty glad that 4 out of 5 people here definitely have Abrahamic old Abrahamic stories from the Old Testament. But one of the things that I'm always reminded of when I get on this topic of religion and freedom of action, just freedom in general, I'm reminded of the Old Testament story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where to make the long story short, King Nebuchadnezzar creates a law saying that people have to worship him as king and bow down to him, or was it a statue of him? Regardless. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were Jews, ancient Hebrews, they refused to because you only bow to God. And they were thrown into the fire, and the angel of the Lord saves them. So I'm reminded of that, how when a law violates, when a law of man violates the law of God, it should be resisted. And that is something that directly exists in the Abrahamic faiths from some of the earliest roots. So I've always found that really powerful. And just to state a position here, that there's a piece. If we move from just the theoretical agorism perspective to the praxis under the state perspective, there's something that can be derived from faith. Now, this only comes from Romans 13, which ironically is the chapter that most Christostatists use to justify being dicks, for lack of a better term. But basically 4 points and some implications and some conclusions. So according to Romans 13, in the Bible, the government or governance is tasked with being the servant of the Lord and as the arbiter of justice for God on this earth, to wield the sword, to be a terror to those who do evil and to honor those who do good. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. Now, obviously, it's the state apparatus that's the problem. It can be governance. It doesn't have to be a state that executes that. But as far as like the fact that the state exists and it's run by man who is fallible and sinful, that is what it is. So implication 1 there is if the governing authority becomes one which honors evil, it has shirked one of the primary responsibilities of being a servant of God. Same thing if it becomes a terror to those who do good. And if it abuses the sword for its own gain instead of punishing evil, it has shirked another responsibility. Therefore, the state apparatus being one that's inherently corrupt, evil, run by man, inherently fallible due to man's sinful nature, the state will fail to uphold these points. And so the conclusions here are, if the state shirks its responsibility to honor good and becomes a terror to those who do good, or if it shirks its responsibility to be a terror to those who do evil and instead honors those who are evil, if the state decides to abuse its authority to wield the sword for its own gain, all these things make it so that it is no longer acting as the servant of God it was appointed as, and therefore it is right to resist it. Even if you want to be at peace with the state, What this ends up giving us is a practical conclusion that if another governing authority comes along who would be a better servant of God, it's the responsibility of the people of the kingdom to at least verbally support that one over the current. Obviously, we would still be completely fine with criticizing them where they fail. But ideologically, what this ends up showing is that there is no state that an imperfect humanity could come up with which would adequately justify following any king other than God. And erecting a human power structure is directly a rejection of the kingship of God, according to 1 Samuel as well.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on just some other capabilities. I mean, one comment I want to make quick on what Penguin was saying earlier very well. There's an old adage that I love where, as researchers are climbing the mountain of science, when they get to the summit, they find the mystics all sitting there already there. And I think that speaks very much to what's going on today, is that scientific research is regularly proving things that were already in ancient texts. Certainly there's a lot of unpacking we could do around that, but that's not necessarily the purview of what we're going for here. I think one of the really powerful, there are quite a few really powerful liberatory aspects to spirituality / religion, pick your term that you want to go with. But one of the ones that I feel kind of inspired to talk about, and part of that is because of Katron being here, with Bruharia, that, like my own of Kabbalah, is very much, and I can be corrected if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is it's very much a oral tradition. It's something that's been, like with Bruharia, I don't think there's a whole lot of, as much as I've done in religious studies, I've rarely ever run into books that talk about it, certainly in English anyway. And I think part of that, much like with Kabbalah, is because it is very much an oral tradition. It's something where there isn't a whole lot written down. And what is so rare, like in Kabbalah would be in Hebrew or in Aramaic or something like that. It's hard to find it, but the beauty in it is that I think that oral tradition, as well as, keeping these practices in, shall we say, obscure books, is actually part of its power, in that it allows for a certain degree of anti-censorship as well as anti-surveillance that allows powerful ideas to continue to be passed down, to survive multiple empires. With my own people, I mean, our traditions have survived multiple empires. As I often say on my show, I mean, I don't see really any, there's no more Romans around me. There's no Philistines. There's none, all these people are long gone. But our traditions are still there. And I think part of that actually comes from this oral tradition, again, that allows for a certain anti-surveillance and an anti-censorship. Not only that, and this is something, and I'd be curious to hear other people's takes on this, particularly like say with Kabbalah, there's very much a certain, what we could call, I want to be, very careful with this term, but there's a certain elitism to it. And in that, this isn't knowledge that's meant to, according to its own precepts. It's not something to get passed around to everybody, or at least not all at once. It's meant to be a bit of a slower thing. I think that kind of certain in-crowd, certain elitism is actually a defense mechanism against authoritarianism. And again, it's part of the reason that I think a lot of these ideas could continue to get passed down without being perverted too much anyway. But I know that there is in a world that's run by the god known as democracy, unfortunately, which is obviously a false god, and a failed one at that. But in a world run by democracy, I think a lot of people want everything. It's like, no, everything should be open. Everything should be talked about. Everything should be, right out there in the air for us to be able to judge and measure and do whatever else. I think there might actually be a little bit of harm in that kind of thinking. I think that there is a power in having secrets. I mean, I even think of, within the history of the United States, part of the reason that, speaking of a liberatory force, now granted, I'm never going to defend any war. I don't believe that there is any such thing as a just war. Talk about a perversion of faith. But, you have the Revolutionary War, or the deposition of King George. It really shouldn't be called a revolution in any sense because authoritarianism is still here. But part of how that was able to actually happen was due to the secret enclaves of Freemasonry at the time, which is openly a religious, we could get into conspiracies around whether or not it's its own religion or whatever. That's certainly an interesting conversation. But because they had these kind of not open secret enclaves, they were able to pass around ideas, even what some would argue, I'm not going to say I am, but what some would argue would be liberatory concepts that led to the founding of, say, the United States of America. I think there's a real power in that. And so I guess I'm wondering if anyone disagrees, do you not like the idea of an oral tradition? Do you not like the idea of, say, of secret spiritual enclaves, things like this? What do we got?
Well, I'm over here just like biting my lip.
Attack.
No, we've had this conversation before. I think everything should be democratized and let the chips fall where they may. And sure, that's one reason. Let's take the Masons because it's a great example of what I'm talking about. So yes, the Masons were a mystical, closed society, and they wielded a great deal of power around the Revolutionary War, and they also put a lot of that power and financial resources into the war and putting in politicians. But I think how do I want to word this? I think the reason you saw what Sheldon Richman calls a counter-revolution of the Federalists is largely because of the power that a lot of those folks wielded, which to the man, all of them were Masons. So I think keeping these things behind closed doors allows a certain amount of power in the hands of a few, and they will wield it politically as long as there is a political, sledgehammer to wield. Or this might be the reason it might make the situation conducive to power structures like that being created through like some sort of priest class. We have a secular rationalist government now, but there was a time when the church was essentially the state, and these are the ones that held God knows what's in the Vatican, right? These are the people that wielded power because they held these practices and traditions in secret, and they were your interpreter in between you, and I'm starting to sound like Martin Luther here, but in between you and your enlightenment, your God, whatever the case may be. So I'm for oral traditions, just to answer your second part first, but I don't think keeping things closed or behind some sort of society or kind of a weird vanguard party for spirituality, I'm not a fan, never been a fan, and I guess that's why I sit more towards the chaos magicians on this one. But no, I'm for everybody learning everything all at once and let what happens. Now, I will say something you said, and then something Katron said earlier started to stick with me. Is I do think the oral traditions. I do think there is a use in having people like scribes or something to pass down oral traditions, because what the ritual Katron was talking about with the egg, that is very, very similar to something in old Celtic paganism. It's something that around I believe it's the holiday of Beltane, where it's not for when you're sick, but it's to celebrate the birth of spring. And I think they also used it for fertility rites and things like that. But that's where the egg from Easter egg comes from. It's the same. It's a very similar ritual. Now, what's fucking weird is I am unaware of the Celts ever making it to Mexico. So I don't know how there could be any kind of cultural contamination there. And maybe they're both passing down oral traditions from a similar source. And I know Brian's cockles just fucking warmed up because this might be the Priscal Theologia, but I guess the point I'm making, I think oral traditions and maybe some sort of scribes of that sort carrying on traditions is probably a good thing because of that reason. Because if those two rituals exist simultaneously in two very separate cultures, then there's oral traditions being passed down that probably have some truth to them, that they've either both come to on their own or there was a singular source for these things. So I'll stop rambling now, but who else has got something to add to that?
Yeah, just a little bit to add there. I like the idea of elitism like protecting the top end, but I don't like the idea of elitism gatekeeping the overall concept. So oral traditions, usually there's two ways they're protected. One of them is, like you said, elitism, people at the top who go back through and check what's being told by others in order to make sure that they're keeping the tradition accurately. And then there's also doing it by just sheer mass, where everyone knows the stories so thoroughly and so effectively that if one person gets a thing wrong, the entire group can be like, no, that's not the story, you changed that, come on, we all know better. I'm reminded of the Christian mystics, some of the earlier ones like Sir Meister Eckhart. His whole position came from a theory called ground, where God is the ground source of reality. He's it's very difficult to explain mystical concepts, like basically all of them. But I think the phrase that describes it the best is that the ground is experience, and the eye with which you see the world is the same eye with which God sees you. That there's a lot of layers to that concept, but basically
that sounds like as above, so below, as within, as without. That's exactly
kind of similar.
Like. Yes, yeah.
Kind of similar. It has a lot of similar veins. That God he observes us through our own faculties. You know, it's that's how he knows us, because he knows us by our deeds, he knows us by our thoughts, he knows us by our actions, and by that there's a combination of the personal relationship, the melding of human action with the will of the divine, and this combination it creates a special relationship. And when it comes to oral traditions, that relationship, well, at least according to the Christian mystical tradition, that relationship is what preserves the traditions. So that there's everyone is supposed to develop that relationship. Not everyone is going to, but the more people who do, because everyone is supposed to, the more the traditions are accurately preserved. So, for example, we know that, you know, while there are micro changes that have happened in biblical texts, like the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Quran, they're not substantive changes. Basically, all the texts have remained essentially identical throughout the years. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls from before the time of Jesus, that we know that aside from maybe like a small grammatical change here where you went from cannot to can't, it's stuff like that actually changes in the stories over time. It's not an actual like textual change. It's not a change of the actual story. It's more like minor grammatical differences, or a period appearing, you know, two sentences being changed to a compound sentence, and but they all still mean the exact same thing. Most of the Abrahamic faiths, from what I understand, and forgive me if I'm wrong about Islam, most of my positive knowledge of Islam comes from a Sufi friend of mine. And I know that a lot of more Orthodox Muslims consider Sufism to be heretical. However, that's where I basically get my knowledge of Islam there. I'm not sure about Brujeria. because I know that's basically all oral traditions that survived by hiding themselves within Catholicism, kind of like Santeria, same sort of deal. But that, long story short, the preservation of the religion comes from the divine, and the combination of having an elitist structure and a mass knowing and understanding is probably a huge preserving factor. So I mean, I guess I'm ambivalent to the point.
Yeah. Just one quick thing. Yes. Sufism is definitely not heretical, actually, but it's a term that can mean a lot of different things. So the original meaning. Now, a lot of people that are very heterodox would be called Sufis. It might be used pejoratively for very heterodox people, but no, it's a long-standing tradition in Islamic religion, and it's not often extremely heterodox. But in regards to what you're saying, I mean, really, in regards to what Dr. Sovryn said, like just describing basically the esoteric nature of and closed off nature of the Kabbalah. I mean, it just really, I guess, in regards to what Zach said in response to that, I mean, it just totally makes sense that a lot of what you guys are talking about. So I guess maybe Zach not included, but a lot of the mystical traditions would be sort of closed off and kept. They're just of the nature where there would be esoteric, like the very definition of esoteric beliefs. That might not be accurate to describe all of your beliefs, but I mean, all these beliefs have some aspect where being esoteric totally makes sense, and that's totally a normal thing. And obviously, I'm looking at my religious faith as being the exact opposite. It's very, it's very exoteric. There's definitely nothing. There's advanced, like theology and metaphysics and stuff that's beyond me, by the way. That just an infinite amount. And I mean, when I say an infinite amount, if you see like an Islamic library, it is just of just religious. I mean, I don't know. It's like jurisprudence and metaphysics and all these different sciences that I can't even list them off. The size of these libraries, and they're very ornate books, is astounding. But the religion itself, actually, the source religion is completely. I mean, it's essentially what you would call open source. It's completely. Every aspect is available, because every aspect is basically the Hadith tradition, which is a little complicated, but basically it's out there, it's known, it's open, it's not 100%, 100.0% absolutely agreed upon exactly the ranking of this and that and the veracity of certain things, or the likely veracity of certain things. But as far as the Quran, that's completely open source, absolutely open source. There's nothing, but there's infinite amount of like exegesis or like a commentary that you can do on that, and some of that's just historical contextualizing, and some of it's actually discussing deeper parts of that, and it goes on and on and on and on, and so there's just 1,400 plus years of like intense, extreme scholarship around this religion, but the source material is absolutely open source, completely, and there's no room for there to be anything that's not known. I mean, there's no secret knowledge about anything. Everything is just there. You might not know where to find it because it's not popularly known, but everything there is. And also I suppose, it's not something that, the source material for our faith is from one generation and one man and in surrounding people that, peace and blessings upon him and his surrounding companions and family and the people around him and the whole historical context of that era. And so it doesn't extend a generation before, even a generation after, although the generation after obviously is very important. And actually the context is very important too. There's actually, the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, his very, very detailed biography is actually a separate thing. That's not one of the big two, the Quran and the Hadith, but it's just extremely interesting if you actually imagine learning about these things and not knowing what the life was like. One thing, not just knowing what life was like for anybody, just generally in that period of time, and then in that region of the world, in the ways they lived, because they were like, there was literally desert nomadic people, and there was literally urban, what they would consider urban people, probably small towns, but sophisticated people that could use money and do accounting and stuff like that as well, and make nice buildings. But like, it's all 100% known, the source material, but how you're able to understand that, how you're able to understand the hundreds of references to what we might call biblical accounts. So like accounts from basically like Old Testament. I mean, Jesus, peace be upon him, would be sort of including that as well, but actually you wouldn't probably get. No, there would be accounts of that too, but like references in the Quran to biblical stuff, and some of those references might not be references to stuff that would be in like your Old Testament, but stuff that would have been known to Jewish people at the time that were living in that region and in those towns. And actually, why did verses exist that referenced these stories? There is actually a very big one that's actually comes from a few centuries about Christians. That comes from a group of Christians that was popularly known in the Roman Empire a few centuries after the time of Jesus. So actually, you do get, even after a very important story that occurs actually in the centuries after after Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. So, but like, if you don't know this. Oh, and I was going to say, so the fact that you would have like a story that references a Old Testament or Old Testament era story that Jewish people would known, is that is supposed to be proof that like, how does this guy come and know your stories that you've passed down orally for generations and generations? It might not even be, there might be a text that exists with that in there, but it might not, it didn't even make it to like today's like Christian, King James version Old Testament. It's apocryphal stories. So, while it's a purely exoteric tradition, like the depth that you're able to go in that is nearly infinite, and really you can't, if you don't have the context there. And luckily we have people that have devoted their lives to it, that still devote their lives to the scholarship now. You really can't understand but just a fraction of it.
I want to hear from Katron more in just a second, but the only thing I want to just drop the mic on everybody and just say that bringing up the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I didn't do on purpose, actually just proves my point that elitism is necessary. That's it. Okay, go.
Real quick, wait, then Katron, then I want to hear your deal. But Penguin, are you familiar? What do you know about the Alawite? Anything?
I think they would be heretical, very heretical.
Okay, sure.
No, they're a funny group of they're an offshoot kind of strange group of Shias, so I wouldn't know anything about them, to be honest with you, and I wouldn't consider them my people for sure.
Okay, that makes sense, because I listened to like several interviews with this guy. He calls himself the Gnostic Muslim, and he's an Alawite. And he says that Alawite is essentially
they're that kind of thing. Yes.
Yeah. He says similar to Katron's traditions, and honestly, there's probably other ones that have done the same thing. They hid themselves within. They're more of a Gnostic sect that sort of hid themselves within Islam, and. Well, just one funny thing that he said, like after you get to a certain level inside these mystery traditions, and he's been doing it for, I guess, 30 years or so, they bring you to a secret place or whatever, and then they start these I don't know, teachers start I don't know what they call them. They're supposed to teach you all these secret traditions. and the first traditions they teach you are all fucking nonsense. So they start feeding you bullshit, and they start making you do weird shit, and they start being mean to you and all these sorts of things. And the goal is you're supposed to resist them. You're supposed to say, no, fuck off. This is nonsense, whatever. And if you don't do that, you don't get taught the mystery traditions. But if you do, if you say, no, this is fucking nonsense, you're being an asshole, then you move on. So I can almost see some sort of selection process like that, where you kind of weed out the assholes and the idiots. So maybe I'm an elitist too. I don't know. Katron, what do you got on this?
So I'm kind of on the fence with this, because obviously, obviously you guys know I'm a devotee to Santa Muerte. So that's definitely a completely open practice. You don't even have to be like, there's no religious, because she's just a deity that, that you essentially follow. But going back on, hiding your religions and things like that, I always think of religions kind of like candomblé, Santeria, where they are closed practices. You have to be initiated. You can't just jump into these practices and say, hey, like, I'm going to wake up and decide I'm going to, start these practices, because these are closed for a reason. These are practices that essentially were they had to be a secret, because obviously, within the Catholic religion, a lot of people, that practice were killed. And obviously, it would be kind of weird for somebody, that comes from, and I'm just not trying to make it weird or anything, but it would just be weird for somebody that, let's just say, has, your heritage is, at some point, obviously you're not the failures of your ancestors, but at some point, you decide that you are, you have slave owner heritage, and you decide to practice a religion that was practiced by slaves. It just doesn't make sense for me that you would want to practice something like that. Now regarding it, and that's just my opinion on that, and I think I'll kind of rest it with that. But with regards to having to hide, kind of religions, you kind of have to, just take it back to things like, for example, how we had with Santa Muerte, that's the capital of city of Tenochtitlan, which we now know is Mexico City, was essentially founded in 1375. So one of the main worship, and I'm just going into my practice with being a Santa Muerte devotee, basically the practice that Santa Muerte is essentially a way that, the indigenous people back then, they worship Mictlantecuhtli, which is this, whose brother is Mictlantecuhtli, who's a god of death in the ancient Aztec religion. Because obviously we don't know it, we don't have any texts on that. All we have is just basic stories and what the Catholic Church decided to keep, because any religious practices, you just can't practice that anymore. So we essentially, it evolved. Essentially what we practice now, it evolved into what was practiced then, because we obviously don't have the text. They were destroyed, unfortunately. So, essentially even early 16th century, the Spaniards, drove the pagan beliefs of the indigenous into secrecy. Basically, we had to hide it. So by the 18th century, the Spanish Inquisition, documents that they decided to keep, they essentially reflected their awareness that they knew that we were a lot of the indigenous people that, lived there. They knew that we were hiding our religion that way, by blending it in with Catholicism. And they were, they didn't care because, at least they're being Catholics, so that was their whole system with that. But yeah, I'm on the fence with it. I think, you should be able to practice whatever you want, but just understand that sometimes some of these traditions that are spoken, that are multi-generational, it's not so much because we don't want to include anybody else or don't want to write it. It's just a lot of anything that we had was probably destroyed, and a lot of it is just spoken down. It's just what I learned from my mother, what I learned from my grandma. It's just, we do have our own personal grimoires per se that we write our stuff in, but that's pretty much all we have because we don't have anything that physical because a lot of the stuff was destroyed and had to evolve to be hidden so that we were still able to practice our traditions per se.
Yeah, I think one important thing is also most traditions in all of human history have been oral, and it's been pretty uncommon to write stuff down. One important reason is that most people didn't have writing at all, or most people, if they did have writing like in their society, they had some proximity to people that read and wrote for a large period of history. Like that was just not a common skill, so it wouldn't be that useful maybe for an esoteric tradition. But in general, like the vast majority in human history, the vast majority of tradition has been oral tradition. And I was thinking about that earlier, just thinking about what traditions have been written down. And I mean, it's very special ones, and it's ones in societies that are sophisticated enough to have like a widespread writing. Just a little trivia, like for example, in the Quran, like to transcribe, and this is very similar to like the Torah, but well, sort of in the way that exact translation is denoted by a bunch of complicated add-ons to the language, essentially. But they had to actually like perfect written Arabic from a I guess you might say you could say primitive written language where there was a lot of ambiguity between ways you wrote stuff. It was very simple, but it was like there's a lot of ambiguity here. It'd be very hard for me to learn and also not like be fluent in the language. And they actually had to standardize an alphabet and writing system and therefore spelling, obviously, to do that. So and that's a fairly sophisticated culture that was on the cusp of having like a decent writing system. Most places in the world wouldn't even have had that. So I mean, obviously there's the large civilizations that going on into like the past couple thousands of years, it became more and more common to have written. But yeah, I mean, I think we should expect anything that's historically grounded outside of the largest civilizations. It's going to be oral, and then even within the traditions where there obviously are texts. I mean, with you wouldn't even see mass literacy up until a certain point. So you would still really have a lot of oral traditions and oral. So I'm actually thinking of oral traditions and the fact that people used to memorize like word for word, long. What could be anything. It could be like sagas, lyric poetry, essentially the scripture itself. A scripture itself of some sort, and on and on and on. I don't want to list all the things you could listen, but including long text. Like people used to memorize, and this is important because like people still memorize the Quran, and this is something that like you cannot really sort of understand if you haven't witnessed this yourself, but you can in fact memorize like down to to the syllable hundreds of thousands of words in the correct order. And that's how we have a lot of the stories. Where do you think we have Homer and all this stuff? I mean, these were not people that were writing this stuff down. So I think it's fascinating to think the fact that basically everything is super ethereal with the internet today, but human beings' minds had to be like fundamentally different because basically they memorized everything. So when we keep saying oral tradition, just want to remind you that is the way of human beings. The fact is, like most of what people have known throughout most of history, certainly not in our time, but most of what people have known, including like word for word literal memorization, and certainly ballads and sagas probably could obviously go through a game of telephone a little bit over time. But I mean, I think people would actually made the effort to keep as much authenticity as possible. They were able to preserve large amounts of information that we would absolutely need computers for.
That actually, you made a great point, and I don't even think you necessarily intended this way, but I think that right there is sort of the difference between our current sort of materialist society and previous societies. And it's possible that we as humans were maybe more powerful for those reasons. And I think that our modern society has made us less powerful as individuals in that way. So like you're saying,
Yeah, it scares me sometimes how much different our minds people's minds had to have been, just like depends on where your ancestors was from, but just a century or centuries or a millennium ago. Like and I think we brought this up on the podcast before, but like it's scary how much capability that they would have had. I mean, obviously they had less actual knowledge and less technology, but how much less capability how much more capability they had mentally in so many ways that we are going to lose even if we gain other things.
Yeah. And okay, so that brings me to a question that I'll open up to everybody. Do we think that this switch from let's say, well, so the Enlightenment thinkers would have called it superstitious. Do we think the switch from superstitious to rationalism was intentional to oppress humans and sort of bring about what we would call the total state? Or do we think this was a natural progression of history and this is sort of a time is nonlinear and this is like a cycle that every society goes through? Anybody?
I have a very short answer on this one. So basically, in my view, I don't see it as intentional. I find most evils to be unintentional, or even to be to try to be beneficially intentional. So for example, we were just talking moments previous about how over time people have lost certain abilities with memorization, with time telling, with conceptualization, visualization. People have lost a lot of these abilities in the modern era. Obviously, you can still achieve those abilities now, but the it's nowhere near as common. Like with Quran memorization, it's or any type of memorization, really, any type of rote memorization, whatever type of memorization you want to refer to. While the traditions can exist still, and the methods to achieve them are still out there, they're rare, man. You do not, like, from my understanding, almost the whole Muslim world could memorize and recite the Quran back in the ancient times, back in like the 600s, 700s. From my understanding, basically all of them. Same thing with the Jewish oral traditions, the early Christian traditions back before the 200s, and Christians were being persecuted. I mean, there were Bibles, but like there might be one Bible in per underground church that literally met underground. We've seen the churches in archaeological digs, very beautiful, but they're completely hidden underground. So there's a point where each of these faiths have had to be in a position where the oral tradition was what took over, and they were memorized. Well, those, for the most part, aside from some niche, more hobby-like practices nowadays, you don't see that anymore. You don't see people memorizing stuff. You don't see people being able to recite ridiculous amounts of stuff from memory. And if you do, it's like, this person's incredibly talented. They're uniquely talented beyond what the normal person is. When that was the normal person back in the day, like people would just have entire swaths of information committed to memory. And as technology has progressed to make life easier for people, because knowledge progresses, people create technology or whatever other else they can in order to make things progress. As these things progress, they become more of a crutch, and that crutch, I'll say it like this: there is an exchange of noetic energy, where the knowledge from previous generations becomes energy put into knowledge that future generations don't have to use. And so you might have people be able to drive vehicles, but now nobody knows how to get a horse to pull a carriage. One last point. That old effort that was put into creating this new technology became a lack of effort that modern people had to. And that's cool to a certain degree. That's helpful because these newer technologies are more efficient and people can learn the newer technology, but most people don't learn their technologies like that. So the less fundamental the knowledge of the technology becomes, and the more that technology relies on educated technicians who've absorbed this ridiculous amount of knowledge from scholars of the past, the more that it's detracted from the knowledge of the current people. I don't think it's intentional, as in somebody or some cabal or something were sitting somewhere and they're like, let's make technology good so people become dumb and we can control them. I think it's more like people started taking advantage of that process the second that they noticed it was happening, because the state, they like to do that.
Yeah, I think keep in mind that through most of history, people have been able, in many cultures, probably most, people have been able to recite their family tree going back for many generations, and depending on the culture, maybe some more generations than others. And, I can look, for example, at my family. I can't, on neither side of my family, I have family that's long time, American in North America. They've clearly been in North America for a while. I can't tell you how long. That's part of this, just what I'm trying to explain. And even my family that's from Pakistan, I can name like the patrilineal, like the patrilineal, going back a generation, I knew my grandfather, and I was very lucky that he lived in this country and lived a very long life. But I could do his father, and I think his father's name, and that's it. And I can go just as far back, basically, on my mom's side, in any branch of that family, and we really don't know. And I'm not even one of the people that are fortunate enough to go back to like the Pilgrim times or the colonial times, or whatever times it would be on my dad's side, into the Mughal times. And it just shows that emphasis wasn't there. It's not that technology changed necessarily, but like the social aspect of that change, like the importance of knowing this information. And I think some stuff was actually lost with my dad's family probably moved over to this country. So there probably might be information that's back in the village and everything. But I can tell you for a fact from my mom's side, because she decries this a lot, because she's like one of these people that I think have kind of rediscovered the importance, or just kind of regretting or trying to prevent the last bits and scraps of this information from going away by using like internet sources and other services maybe that compile these records. But it just shows that like there was a time generationally before my mom's generation where like for several generations it just wasn't important to know that information or pass that information, or to say like, when did you arrive in this country, where did you come from? People that would write down, a lot of stuff is from Bibles, like people would write down birth dates and people baptized and died and stuff like that. But clearly some of this stuff just stopped being important and stopped being passed down. And we're trying, and I think a lot of people with the computer records and computerized, records are trying to recapture this before it totally goes away. So like I said, just in different eras and different times, regardless of the technology, because in this case, technology might help us actually find some of that information that might be very hard to access unless you want to do a lot of, driving around and looking at very old records that are probably falling apart. So it's not even the technological aspect. Like it's sort of the mindset of people of an age that changes over time.
Yeah, I'm gonna push back a little bit. I mean, talking about the Enlightenment, getting like to the source of sex question there. I'm gonna push back a little bit on the idea that they didn't really intend a lot of what came out of the Enlightenment. I think they very much did. I think so. It's important to understand what was the purpose of the Enlightenment? How did this happen? I mean, it wasn't like there was 10 people who said, all right, we're going to do the Enlightenment. It wasn't that for sure. But so the Enlightenment comes out of the Florentine Renaissance, right? This idea, where this tremendous wealth ends up in Florence, and people like they're just living it up. Sky's the limit as far as what they can do. And they're looking for, wait a minute, life is good on Earth, yet the Catholic Church is telling them, no, you shouldn't care about what moth and rust can destroy. And so, but they're pushing back on that. And what do? Of course, eventually they find, kind of the remains or what is of the Byzantine Empire, which still holds on to some of the ancient Roman humanist traditions, right? Which says, no, you can have the good life right here. And so the Florentine Renaissance, with the wealth that came into Europe at that time, is what kind of kicks this off. And then it becomes, okay, no, can we understand how God works? And the Enlightenment, in my opinion, it's not just mine, but in my opinion, really did start because what you had was, with people with all this wealth and time, were trying to actually prove that God existed. But what ended up happening was, after a generation or so, is they discover, wait a minute, no, there doesn't have to be a God, or maybe they'd even make the stronger statement that there is no God. And once they do this, it becomes their justification very much to live that good life and not worry about what moth and rust can destroy. And it's really their authority, and it becomes an earthly authority for them to no longer follow the whatever orders were coming from the Holy Roman Empire at the time. So for them, it was very much a sense of freedom to finally get rid of God. And it allowed them to, arguably enjoy their life. The problem that came out of that, though, is once they see this, then and develop the scientific method and so on, is that they no longer believe in the immeasurable. They no longer believe in anything that can't be measured, because if it's something that can't be measured, it doesn't exist. All that exists is what they see before them, and again, what they can measure. And when that happens, they want to extend their power to the point that I think they go for quite a bit of homogeneity. And I think when you look at, and I'm not even getting conspiratorial, and I'm not even necessarily being negative, but I mean, when you look at the genuine, say, Bavarian Illuminati or the Freemasons or whatever, there was a push for a certain degree of homogeneity. And there was this stamping out of anything that you could not measure. And I think that was very much intentional, because then that creates the, like the Royal Society, in Britain, which basically has all the purview over what is considered real and not real in the Western world at the time. I really do think that the Enlightenment, again, it failed in what I was talking about earlier, that they denied the interior universe because they couldn't measure it. But once that happened, I mean, I think they absolutely had the intention of wanting to stamp that out and wanting to stamp out anything that, again, that they actually couldn't measure. So I think this led to where a lot of oral traditions disappeared. I think this is part of where, I mean, and one of the places you can see this expressed the most, I think, actually is in the Americas, where, people who only had oral traditions and didn't have written books were very quickly targets to be converted into that which they could, more easily measure, say, even with a book or something like that. For example, with First Nations peoples, right? I mean, so many of those traditions, sadly, are just gone. And I don't think that was unintentional at all. If anyone wants to respond to that, go for it.
Yeah, I think both materialism and the democratic state must necessarily push for homogeneity, because with homogeneity comes a reliable output. So it's something that you can consistently measure and categorize. So if you're a rationalist atheist and you want to measure all things, then deviations from the norm cannot be accepted, because you can't do math that way with so many deviations. So same thing with democracy. If if you have a democratic state, then more or less everybody has to be on the same basic page, and deviations from the norm are not welcome because it's not measurable. You can't make logical, rational decisions in our modern nation state and all these sorts of things if there is not a consistent I keep using the word output because I can't think of another, but there is no consistency if everybody's kind of doing their own thing. So that there is I think these two things have the same source, and it is the Enlightenment, but there is a push for stamping out of the other, and a push for homogeneity for that specific reason. And I think I think that's a lot of what we see today. I think that this is the result of that. So, wait, you got something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, when I said unintentional, I didn't mean like completely like beyond not oh man. I don't mean unintentional in the manner where like you have sex but you don't intend to get pregnant. I meant unintentional more in the manner of like you went out of your way. Deliberate. There we go. Not deliberate, and maybe intentional, but not deliberate. Does that make more sense?
Maybe where you don't know where it's going, or
exactly,
you know what I mean?
Exactly. Like
the final,
like it's not
the ultimate effects of.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like
I mean, I'll say quick. I think there were some Enlightenment figures who didn't realize it. I mean, for example, like William Whiston, and of course William Whiston's best friend Isaac Newton. These guys were full-on mystics, or at least full-on religious, particularly in Whiston's case. So, yeah, I hear you. I do think that at some point, though, there were people who absolutely were top-down looking out there and saying, no, we got it. We have to get rid of this. And that's unfortunate, that happened, because I do think you look at some of the earlier Enlightenment figures and you see some really brilliant things coming out of that. Somewhat in the works of Isaac Newton, or even within my own tradition, you find where there were lots of people who were even Christians who were looking back now to wait a minute, like because what the Enlightenment basically said is that humans are the gods, right? Now, I know some here may bristle on that. I won't. I actually largely agree with that, or at least not. If gods isn't the right term, they're co-creators. Okay, that message started to hit, but they missed the point that everybody has value, and when you start to only care about what can be measured, you start to find what's worthy and what's not, what's better, what's lesser, all of these things, and that attitude, just starts to prevail. And you see it suddenly appear in so much of the writing after, say, the 16th century, where, okay, now we're really categorizing people. It's not just a problem that, the Jews don't believe in Jesus. No, they're inferior. There's this, there's that. It's not that they're evil. No, you start to get this language that there are people who are less, and maybe not even worthy of grace. Say God's grace.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence that the rise of the Enlightenment saw the rise of scientific racism, right?
Yes, exactly.
Now we have to measure and categorize humans. And I would say that a better way to look at the Enlightenment, and there's good and bad with the Enlightenment. I don't mean to take shits on it all the time, but I often do. It's not that it's not that they sort of dethroned God and placed humans on high. I would say they removed God and placed rationalism with a capital R as God, right? So it's not that, I don't think it was so much about empowering humans as individuals, more so empowering systems of measurement and logic and reason and all these things as to be placed on high, right?
Sure.
Something that transcends humans, and it is eternal. You know what I mean? And the rule, the rules of the universe. It is eternal. This logic and reason, and humans are sort of just numbers in that sense. But I think for me, that's how I look at the, and I'm not the only one for sure that looks at the Enlightenment. I don't think it was about really empowering humans as individuals at all. It was more about lumping humans into groups more than anything else. But sorry, go ahead. Katron's got a break. Did everybody else answer the question? Yeah, sort of. Not intentional, but maybe it's kind of, sort of. At the very least, I would say that whether or not I do think there is some intentionality behind it, I don't necessarily think that. Maybe I do agree that they didn't understand quite to the extent of where this would go. I think a lot of Enlightenment thinkers would look at today's society, and Brian brought up a great example of the alchemist Isaac Newton, who would be appalled at what he sees in our society and our values that we place on materialism above all else. But we can all agree that this is more or less oppressive to humans, or controlling humans in some way, or limiting, very limiting. We were sold a thing where it's like we put in 40 hours at a job we hate, and you buy all the stuff, and you trust your experts, and you're nothing more than a meat bag, and consciousness is just a series of synapses and chemicals in your brain, and all of these things. It all leads to limiting of human potential, I would say.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's intentional is, I guess kind of irrelevant, although it's interesting. But it is certainly useful at controlling humanity. You know what I mean? At least that's my thought on it. If we, one more thing.
If I could jump in. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Fine, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say to always point about it, what's unintended. What I think is unintended is, and where I would agree, is they didn't realize that basically just telling the human being that you are just an animal, which we are animals, okay, but you're not just an animal. The thing is, it becomes, especially in scientific research, it becomes an either or. And so I think a major failing with a lot of, especially modern faiths, is the denial of the body, because effectively what you have is a science is saying God doesn't exist. Okay. So then, and science just says, I'm just an animal. So then the religious response is, well, I'm just a spirit, when I don't think that's true either. You're both. Okay. And even within Christianity, whether people want to admit it or not, you're supposed to be getting a body back, whenever the second coming, or the millennium, or whatever, however you want to believe it,
Amen.
Is supposed to happen. Okay. So there's a body. So this confusion, it creates this unintended consequence. I think of this is a very real problem, that you have an animal nature and a spiritual nature, and you have to respect both. Otherwise you are incomplete in your own head. And I see that as one of the major problems, and what keeps spirituality from being a liberatory force is it doesn't allow you to holistically understand, and that's WHO, not HO, though I guess maybe the HO would work too. It doesn't allow you to completely understand what you are. It doesn't allow you to respect your animal nature, and it doesn't allow you to respect your spiritual nature.
Yeah, go back to fuck Plato, right? That's just the mind-body duality, and this is true even amongst mysticism too, right? Where they hold the spirit and the mind on high, but the body is, basically worthless flesh. Looking at
it's a mistake,
right?
Yeah,
it's an aberration in our black iron prison, or whatever the thing, So, I think you're on to something there for sure. I tend to agree with what you're saying, and honestly, there might not be a dichotomy between mind, body, and spirit, but that's a different conversation. Katron, what do you think about all this?
You guys have pretty much hit all the points, so I'm just gonna leave it at where it's at.
Okay. Do you think that sort of the Enlightenment age putting rationalism and materialism on a pedestal has been useful for controlling humans and preventing like human liberation?
Honestly, I can see the way that it can be. In my opinion, just kind of like, sorry, I just wasn't prepared to like respond. But I essentially think that, just when you have like certain religious practices that are just set that you can't, that are restrictive, you are not, allowing the individual to be themselves, and you are restricting liberation. So I think it's kind of like, I'll just shorten that with that.
Okay, right on. Well, we should probably
One
wrap
last
this up.
point.
Yeah.
One
Let
last
everybody get a
point
last
on that
point.
topic.
Yep.
This is the exact mentality that leads to the you will eat the bugs, you will live in the pod mentality. So in that regard, it definitely has been used to control people.
Oh, you're saying materialism leads to this? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll go back to the idea that basically, I mean, the best evidence we have of something being wrong with the kind of the enlightenment and the material shift is basically the fact that you go back to like the Nietzschean point and the larger point where people tend to recreate the institution of religion, and where it's often not, it's not theological. So it's not theistic, and there's no God involved. There's no like necessarily like the same type of supernatural or anything supernatural at all. Or could it just be like, maybe we could be talking about, it could be supernatural in a different way. Maybe it's like some sort of like theoretical science or something, or actually in many cases, but recreating many of the features of religion, and people keep doing, but not that I'm not saying that a certain thing like the Enlightenment, scientific materialism and so forth. I'm saying that people, generation after generation in the past few generations, where like religion has had a even further and further less influence over our society, repeatedly have different analogs or replacements or whatever for religious belief that has like dogma and like faith, like articles of faith and rituals and practices. And I mean, I guess from my own religious point of view, I would just simply say that it's better to actually do that in the name of the actual real God. But to a more universal, in a more universal sense, like you're giving up this long historical thing that certainly claims to be real, and just sort of it's creating what I think's been called, and I think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is Nietzsche, like it's creating like a God-shaped void in people's lives, and then people fill that with basically something that's analogous.
All right, so we got to wrap up soon, but I'll let everybody get in a closing thought, and if you want to plug your things, and also, do we think we've gone far enough with this, or do you think we should have another one? Brian, we'll start with you.
All right. I'm certainly down to talk about this at any point. I think one of the things we didn't talk about, I'll be very quick. One of the things we didn't discuss, the uses of religion or it as a spirituality as a liberatory force, is, regardless of what happens, say what we were talking about during the Enlightenment, it's still something that is very much respected, and it's still something seen by billions of people around the world as something that is higher than government. And rightfully so, because I think that's just an innate part of our nature. That we're all kind of recognizing. And in that, you can use it, say, during tragic situations where you may be forced to get a untested jab in your arm, at varying times, that where it is something, because it is so recognized, it is a useful tool against the state to say, no, my book or my God or my ISP being individual spiritual practice, says I can't take that. I can't do that. Equally, spirituality has been incredibly useful for even holy books have been useful for hiding messages and being sent, across very long distances. One example would be, I know we quoted the book of Daniel earlier, and while I think Awe actually quoted it earlier with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, while there's parts of that book that I do think are reflecting some kind of history, I think there are also parts of that book that are actually coded battle language from during the time that during a revolt that was happening with the Maccabean revolt with my own people. And so even if you're somebody that doesn't want to, that doesn't legitimize internally this concept of spirituality or religion, these things can be tools that you can use, partly because they are so widely recognized. And again, I argue they're widely recognized because it's the truth, but even if you don't think that, they're widely recognized as useful, or they're widely recognized as being more powerful than any man-made authoritarianism that is out there. So it's always worth it for that alone, because I think it can be useful to the individual in that way. So maybe we don't have to do a separate episode because I just got all that out there. So with all of that said, I will concede the rest of my time and just want to make the point that maybe the Enlightenment was really trying to say, and that is, we are all royalty, but we all just have a terrible case of amnesia. And I think when we accept those words, we recognize who and what we are and how powerful we are individually. And if you want to hear more of this kind of stuff, just head over to sovryntech.com, SOVRYN tech.com, or you could go to nwo.red, but that might scare people. So that's it for me.
I love it every time. Katron, do you have any closing thoughts? Also, glad to have you here, and would you come on again?
Yeah, definitely happy to be here. And yeah, I would definitely come on again. I think one thing that, speaking of liberation, that we just, and religion, we kind of, I feel maybe it was touched upon during the last conversation, but, sometimes we haven't touched the scary part of how religion can also influence negatively, like within the state, just taking for example, as I previously mentioned, within the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, things like that. I mean, it would be a good point to, I don't know, I think just to kind of visit that. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, certainly. The downside.
I would love that
side.
Because
yeah.
I think my religion's probably the one that's been the most abused by the state for doing evil, when it's probably one of the most peaceful and against it if you actually follow the precepts. So I would love to talk about that.
We can do that. That might get heated, but we can do that. Yeah, I'm definitely down. Katron, do you have anything else to add? Something to plug? Something like that?
No, thank you guys,
Cool.
For sharing your, your points of views. And I think for the most part, I think we could agree. So it's nice.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. It'll be after Mother's Day when you hear this, but happy Mother's Day and happy birthday to anybody that has a birthday, that the mothers are stealing all the glory from. And
man, you're ratting me out. What is this?
Hey, man, I left it open to you. You didn't have to say nothing. The mothers are stealing your thunder, Brian. What the heck?
It's been driving me nuts for 43 years now. I can't stand it. No, they're worth it. That's all right. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I've got hot MILFs in my area. You know what I mean? So,
life's
downstairs.
Good.
I mean, yeah. But no, happy Mother's Day to the moms out there, and Everybody be excellent to each other. Oh, wait, did you want to plug a thing? My brain's scattered. You still there?
No problem, man. Yeah. So everyone who liked what I had to say, please check out the I Hate the Antichrist podcast. There I talk about, mostly I talk about the nature of evil. Season 1, we mostly just complained about how awful people and the state are, but it's getting more into the nature of evil now, because I've kind of started to solidify what I call my anti-theology, which is basically just a study of evil and how it mocks what is good. So if you like that idea, please check out the I Hate the Antichrist podcast. And I recently interviewed Jacob Daniel Winograd. He is the lead communicator at LCI, the Libertarian Christian Institute. And I did another episode that will be coming out tomorrow with White Trash Socrates, a Catholic apologist. We talked about the nature of sin, which, that's my thing. So if anybody's interested in that, please check me out. That is oeui.live or I Hate the Antichrist podcast on major podcast platforms.
All right, right on. Well, thanks all of you for coming on. This was dope, and we'll probably do another one. And everybody be excellent to each other. And Penguin, you got anything on the closing out?
No, yeah, it was a blast. I'm down to do the next one for sure. I wish you guys the best.
All right, peace, everybody.
Peace.
Bye.
Peace.